Just now, we talk about what is evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. After knowing these concepts, it's the time for us to acknowledge there always exists a gap between education practice and educational research. Now we are going to talk about this gap. If you look at the journal publications of education research paper, sometimes you may see, hey, this is very interesting, but how can I apply it in my daily education practices, in my classroom instructions? On the contrary, sometimes we heard from senior teachers that they have very good instructional methods, and also from some junior teachers that they have very innovative ideas how to activate the teaching in the class. But we cannot find a theory to support such kind of innovative ideas and very good instructional methods. So sometimes they cannot research and practice, they cannot support each other. This is a pity. And a lot of education professionals, those practitioners, they tend to rely on the knowledge from their previous training, from their previous education program, and also from some stereotypes, some opinions, trends, some first case, and also from advices from their senior colleagues in the school. You may have noticed that the first several years for junior teachers, they are very innovative. They want to use this and that to try it in the class. But after several years, they tend to be influenced by the other colleagues, by the environment. Then they tend to lose their motivation to innovate the class-based instructional design, the practices. And also, if we reflect on our education research, we also find the majority of education research actually has very little quality. The quality is not very satisfying. And we have talked a lot about evidence-based research, and we say that randomized the trial is experimental design is always the best, most reliable way for us to collect the data, to collect the evidence. Randomized controlled trial, the RCT. However, in practices, there is very little research using randomized controlled trial. I remember in one article, discussion article, Professor Paul Kirshner has written, and he mentioned in 2006, in the ERA conference, which is a huge international education research conference, 2006. In this conference, there were 11,000 education research presentations, the paper accepted, 11,000. And out of these 11,000 education research reports, only 12 have used randomized trial control. So only 12, from a strict meaning to say, if we keep it strict, only 12 out of 11,000 have the quality in educational research. So this is a pity. Most of the education research still nowadays are not using randomized controlled trials. And this book was written by researchers from University of Amsterdam, Broekkamp and Van Hout-Wolters. And this topic is de kloof tussen onderwijsonderzoek en onderwijspraktijk. So they discuss about what is the problem. There is a gap between research and practice in education. What is the reason? And what could be the oplossing, the solution for that? And they propose 4 frequently mentioned core problems. The first one is our research deliver too little convincing results to the practitioners. Most of the time, we rely on some soft beweis, some Sachbeweis, yeah, soft evidence. And this kind of results cannot convince the teachers, cannot convince the school directors that they can apply these findings into their practices. And the second is the research deliver to little findings that can be directly applied into practices, or the findings with a clear instructions how they can apply it in the practices. We see frequently in the education research paper, they say, hey, this way is very effective. If you do this, students' learning achievement will be improved. However, there is no any instructional guidelines how we can apply it in practices. It is aiming at what kind of target group. The student level can be very different. And also, the school environment can be different. So there is very little message about the context, a little message about how we can apply it step by step, systematically in the practice. And such kind of research reports frustrate the practitioners to adopt the research, and gradually they lose interest to read it. The third one is the practitioners tend to think that the education research is not practical. It's always very theoretical, with a lot of statistical data, with a very long literature list, while this one is completely disconnected with what we have seen in the class. The fourth is practitioners find it very difficult to effectively use the education research. They don't know how to use this research to test their practice in the class, in the school. I still remember the first year when I was a PhD student, that was in 2004. I went to a training for all the PhD starters of educational research in Utrecht. And then in the training, we need to share our ambition. And I said, in the coming years, coming 4 years of PhD study, I'm going to focus on ICT technology in education. This is my research focus. And I'm planning to publish as many articles as possible so that I can change the practice of teachers in the school. And then I was immediately interrupted by a professor in education research. And he said, I'm sorry, you are too ambitious. Actually, we do the research, we publish in the journals, but very few teachers will read our journal publications. Well, at the beginning, I didn't believe it. I still worked very hard, tried to publish as many articles as possible. I set up my own theories about computer-supported collaborative learning. I published articles in the top journals. And one day, I was hired as a teacher in Hangzhou, in the International Business School. I came to the school and I found that the ICT application in my school is still very limited. Then I'm wondering, I published so many articles, why my colleagues have no chance to read them? And then I talked with them. Gradually, I can understand, because the teachers are all engaged in practical work in the classroom, assessment, instructions. There are a lot of work for them. And our publications is in the journal. And no one, if they don't have certain tasks, none of them will go to the educational journal and to read what is the newly publications and how I can apply it in the practice. I'm so sorry to find this is the truth in practice. We are all engaged in a lot of practical work. We are overloaded. So how to connect with education research? There is no bridge between them. So I find even at this moment, this is still a problem. And if we reflect on our education research, we can find the following problems. The first one is there is too little research which is conducted in a realistic and a real class situation. I take my own research as an example. I focus on computer-supported collaborative learning, how the secondary school students can solve physics questions in a group discussion. They are paired and they try to help with each other to solve the problem together. And I went to a Dutch secondary school, a VWO, try to capture the data there, try to set up the setting, let the students to work on it. And then I find it's very difficult. First, you need to think about the sample size. If the sample size is too small, it's not meaningful for you to find hard evidence. Yeah. And second, you need to invite the students to participate in your study. And in order to find their cognitive change, it cannot be done only for once. You need to go there repeatedly for several weeks or sometimes even 1 or 2 years to see how their knowledge is built up. And this requires that the students need to voluntarily join your program for quite a long time. But on volunteer basis, very few students are willing to do that. And then what we have to do is we apply for certain fundings. We try to sponsor the student to participate in it. And in order to make it more effective, we constructed an artificial experimental setting, which is different as their real class setting. And then we set up a certain online environment to trigger them to work, to solve the physics questions one by one. And then we look at their communication content online. And then I'm thinking the limitation of this research is these students are sponsored to come to join this research. So their motivation is different as their motivation in the normal class. And these are a small parts of the students, cannot be really representative of the general group. So I have the findings, but I find it very difficult to connect my findings with the practice in this VWO, in this secondary school. So my research is done in a class which is artificially set up. It's not in a realistic class situation. So that is one of the limitations. And the second one is a lot of education research, they talk about the intervention, what kind of treatments may help students to improve their academic performance. But they tend to ignore that the students' learning is very sensitive to the context. And in here, the context is a very complicated, complex system. It could be the context of the school, or the class, or the teaching environment, or their families. So if we say this method works well, but I cannot guarantee this method may work well for another group in another context. And the third one is that too little research focused directly on real life questions. We tend to focus on a lot of theoretical questions. And if you intensively review a lot of publications from the education journals, you can see they always use such kind of formulation. In the past research, there is very little research addressed this problem, the blah, blah, blah. These are all theoretical deficiency in the past research. But what about practice? Is this still needed? Is still significant to do this research to solve the practical problems. So we seldom reflect on it. And I think one of the reasons for that is most of the researchers, they want to have their paper published in the journals. And if you submit an article to the journal, and if you, in this research report, you can find a significant difference, you get higher probability this article can be published. But in other words, if you focus on practical problem, and then later you find, hey, there is no significant difference, actually happens frequently in practice. And then this one can have little chance to be published. So this is the dilemma of research and practice. And the fourth one is there is too little research focused on developer powerful and applicable tools for the practice. It's only about what kind of theory can be used in practice. As I said, how the teachers can directly apply it in practice. We need instruments. We need kind of tools, guidelines how to use these tools. Yeah, well, this is always missing. And the fifth one is there's too little research focused on the implementation of the previous findings. A lot of previous findings are specific in certain context, but how this can be implemented in the current new context, this is always something that the researchers tend to ignore. They always focus on, I want to propose some new innovative thinking of that. They tend to ignore in classrooms, perhaps some traditional methods is very effective. And such kind of traditional methods have never been empirically tested yet. Number 6 is there is a little research by the teachers into their own teaching practice. I always believe the best educational researchers should be the teachers. They have sufficient practices. They are very sensitive to see the context, and they know what is the best, what is the worst for the students. I remember that the first year I came to Hangzhou University as a docent, as a lecturer, my senior colleague suggested me, you need to keep a class attendance list because the class attendance list can predict the students' exam performance. Well, I don't believe it. So I think students come to my class based on their motivation. If they don't have the motivation, they just physically sit in the class, mentally absent. It's nonsense to have the classroom attendance list. So I normally didn't have it. But the senior colleagues, she always keeps the classroom attendance list. And she also told me, we have 7-week teaching, and in week 8, that is the exam week. And she said, according to her experience, the first 4 weeks may well predict students' performance in the exam. If the students were not very active or seldom show up from week 1 to week 4, but then week 5, 6, and 7, the last 3 weeks, these students suddenly pop up and behaved quite actively in the class. And this actually is not related to their performance in the exam. And now we had a COVID crisis. All of our education are moved online. And we have the online classrooms. And all the student attendance are automatically recorded in the server computer. And then this is the time for me to do the research. In the normal classroom, the face-to-face classrooms, I didn't have the classroom attendance list. But now in the online classrooms, I have the attendance list because the server computer generates that. And in the last study period, I've looked into one of the subjects, management accounting, and I collected the attendance of 325 students from week 1 until week 7. And what to my surprise is, it's true, the first 4 weeks of the students' performance will predict their performance in the exam. So those who are active in the first 4 weeks tend to score higher in the exam. And those who only showed up very shortly in the online class or only showed up for one or never in the first 4 weeks, they failed in the exams. And this is exactly what my senior colleagues suggest me to do. So this makes me thinking, I'm start thinking of that. So the teachers, they themselves have the gene to be a very good researcher. So, however, in the current education research, we find a lot of research are only done by the researchers themselves and not by the teachers who directly facing the students, directly teaching use these methods in their classes. So this is a pity. The majority of the researchers are not the teachers in practice. And the number 7 is very little research look into the educational policy and the learning materials. We focus a lot on instructional methods, but we tend to ignore the learning materials or the school policy may also influence the effectiveness of the instructions. So these are the 7 points that we reflect on the shortcomings of educational research. And we have already discussed that our evidence-based intervention originated from the healthcare research, from the medicine research. And if we go back to look into the medicine research, healthcare research, we want to see how they solve the problem. The Kloof, tussen onderzoek en praktijk. This may also happen in the healthcare research. And in this policy document published in 2017, they also talk about that. And the title of this book is very interesting. It is called Zonder context geen bewijs. So without a context, we cannot generate a bewijs, evidence. And they propose, instead of using evidence-based practice, why not claim it as why not see it as a context-based practice? It is more relevant than evidence-based relevance. So they focus a lot on the context. And what is the context? They said, a good health care is not only statistics, but it is related to the context. Like what the patients they want. How about their conditions? What is the doctor's knowledge source and other source that can be used? Yeah, is there any other small studies that can provide information about it? So there are a lot of elements in the context we can take into account. And back to education practices. There still have some practical problems. If we do the research in practices, we sometimes get frustrated because the bewijs is not beschikbaar. You know that all the schools, no matter basisschool or middelbare school or the higher education, all these education programs are very, let's say, systematically designed. So every elements are logically connected with each other. And sometimes if you miss one part of that, it's difficult for you to retrospect or to get the data back from the previous cohort. For example, we are always interested in, we have this education program, And is this effective for our graduates in the job market? And in order to know the information from the job market, the best is ask our alumni. And every year in our school, there are around 300 alumni. So 300 or more students graduated from our business school. And in the past 26, 27 years, we have thousands of graduates. And we try to get their information, but we find it's very difficult. This data is difficult to retrieve. We send emails to the students, but a lot of mail addresses are no longer available. And we send LinkedIn messages to the students, but the response rate is quite low. And the second is, can the practice be changed? Sometimes I had enthusiasm to change certain subject I'm teaching, but I also need to keep in mind I'm not the only teacher teaching this subject. We have 10 classes in this year group, and there are 5 teachers teach this subject together. And I change my instructional practices, but I cannot convince the others they also need to change it, because that is different as their teaching style, and they are overloaded with other tasks. So sometimes we find, too busy, we cannot change the practice. That's a very practical problem. And also have some conceptual problems. Like the teachers, we encourage them to adopt some innovative, some new instructional method, but then they tend to argue, can the evidence be trusted? Can the evidence be applied? Can the evidence-based practice incorporated with other forms of knowledge and values? Like with the picture I showed it here, some teachers are quite stubborn, but that is the fact. That is the reality. Sometimes it's quite difficult to change people's conceptual problems, conceptual understanding of education research. So there is a long way to go through that. And in the next video, I'm going to show you an example how the education theory, how the randomized controlled trial is applied in practices and how it is tested by researchers and contribute to the practices.